All right, it looks like it's 1 o'clock and going to get started. Now, I think all of you have made a terrible mistake. The talk you want to see is downstairs, okay? The plug-in talk, right? Actually, I'm very happy at this crowd, and Nathan is very hard to compete against. I love Nathan Walker and the other guys downstairs, so thank you very much for coming here. Today, my name is Jeff Whelpley. I'm the CTO of GetHuman. I am a developer, Google developer expert, and I've done a lot of stuff in the Angular world. I have been a contributor to Angular Core for a while. I built Angular Universal, which is the server rendering library for Angular, and I used to host Angular Air and done a whole bunch of other stuff. And so I'm here today, not surprisingly, to talk about Angular. And also with me today is my friend Rob right there. He was raising a hand. So during the course of this talk, if you guys have questions and that type of thing, definitely just raise your hand. And if I'm in the middle of something, Rob will come by to get it and try to coordinate things. And I may pass some stuff off to him during the course of the talk. So how many people don't know Angular at all? Raise your hand. Okay, we actually have a couple people, great. How many people know it a little bit, just kind of gotten started? And how many people know it really well? Okay, this is what I thought was gonna happen. So the good news is that I have set this talk up to be beneficial to all three of you, all three groups of you. And it looks like it's about split a third on each side. And it's really to talk about what is Angular, talk about the landscape in terms of all the other frameworks out there and where does Angular fit in. I'm going to go over a different type of tutorial, something that you probably haven't seen before, but I think that you'll find interesting for everybody from all three of those camps. And then we'll just go over a simple getting started. Depending on the time, it's a weird thing having a 90-minute talk. I've actually never done this before. I'm used to kind of the quick 20-minute talks that are all scripted out. And so I actually have no idea how long this is going to take. So depending on how far we get with the getting started, I actually have some extra bonus stuff that we can potentially do, which will be good for especially the people that are more experienced will get some extra stuff. And then I want to talk about the future. I want to talk about Angular 5 and what is yet to come, some of the exciting stuff that is on the horizon. So first, let's talk about the landscape. And it is a very rich landscape when it comes to front-end JavaScript development. There are so many different options you have when you want to build something today. And it's great. It's awesome. It's very different than it used to be. Who builds with something besides Angular? Anything else on the list, either React or Vue or anything like that? Yeah, so there's a bunch of you do that, and that's very typical. 4 or 5 years ago when Angular first came out, it was more like this. It was Ember, Backbone, Knockout. We're like, does anybody remember Knockout? Did anybody? You had a couple people use it. Oh, that's great. It's still around, but Microsoft has obviously pushed a lot more for Angular more recently. In fact, just as a total side note, I actually didn't have this in the presentation at all, but the creator, one of the creators of Knockout, actually has worked with me on Angular Universal for some of the implementations on the Microsoft side. So they've gone whole hog into the Angular world. But when it first came out, almost right away, there was it didn't take too long before a lot of these articles of this versus that, Ember versus Backbone versus Knockout versus Angular. I'm sure pretty much everyone in this room has read something similar of one of these competition articles. More recently, it's been more on the Angular versus React. Actually, much more recently, actually, when it first came out, it was more even-handed, I would say. But over time, you started seeing more of a focus on this type of thing, which is totally ridiculous. But it gets a lot of clicks. There's a lot of articles that people love to talk about there's that. More recently, with a lot of the licensing issues with React that has come out, if you guys have seen that, there's a lot of articles of the Vue versus React, which is some good comeuppance, I think, for React to feel a little bit what it is on the other side of this discussion. But if you ask me what my opinion is of this type of framework war and where Angular fits in, my opinion sort of is illustrated very perfectly in a 2014 or 2015 ngConf talk by this guy, Dave Smith. Dave is very great, good developer. He works for Amazon now. He also runs the Soft Skills podcast, if you guys listen to that. Awesome guy. And back in 2015, he gave a talk about Angular versus React in terms of performance. And so he ran a bunch of tests where he had AngularJS, the kind of old version of Angular, and he added a whole bunch of DOM elements and saw that it slowed down over time. And then he put it on React, like the same exact thing, and it was much, much faster. And then he showed Angular, the new version of Angular, the latest one that had just come out, and it was even faster. Of course, right after he put it out, there was this onslaught of people from the React world who were ripping his presentation to shreds, pointing out all sorts of things that he did incorrectly, things that he could have done to improve the performance. And Dave issued a correction afterwards and showed that, yes, React actually, when you make these changes, is faster. But then, right after that, people added on the Angular side, the latest version of Angular this is, and they showed that actually when you add these other special tweaks, that Angular is still just right in line with React. So in terms of the performance in what Dave was trying to show, after a bunch of back and forth over the subsequent couple of weeks, the latest version of Angular and React were like right there, and then, but clearly AngularJS, such a junky framework, that terrible old news was way last and was terrible. Except that my good friend, Dr. Gleb Balmatov, does anybody know this guy? Okay. You should definitely follow him on Twitter. Definitely, regardless of even Angular, he knows a lot of stuff about Angular, but he's just like a great person to follow just in the JavaScript world. And Dr. Gleb was like, I don't think they're doing this. I don't think they're giving Angular 1, the old version of Angular, its proper due. I think I could do better. So he actually took the same example that Dave was using for his comparison, and he actually got Angular, the old version of Angular, on par with React and the new version of Angular. The same performance level. And this sort of typifies what my feeling is, that it isn't as much about the framework. It's about, we're all on the JavaScript platform. We're all working with JavaScript. And at the end of the day, you can make hacks to whatever framework you're working on to make it equivalent, either feature-wise, performance-wise, or whatever, with anything else. So when you look at Angular versus all these other frameworks, if you ever read anything about performance or feature A or feature B or whatever, the reality is that you can do whatever you can do in one framework, you can do in another framework, period. The trick is, and the key to what the actual difference is, what you actually should care about, isn't that you can't do something in another framework. It's how easy it is, how much aligned is one with what you want to do. And that I think is very specific to both the product you're trying to build and your culture. So I want to get into like a little bit of like what is Angular, and I think even for the people that are experienced in this audience, like one thing I found is that, and I'm sure that for the experienced developers, Angular developers here, you almost certainly had this, where you've had discussions with other people, especially React fanboys, people that are very enthusiastic about Vue, whatever, when they ask you, oh, like why do you use this instead of that or whatever. So hopefully, you don't have to use this same exact line of argument that I'm going to give, but hopefully this will give you some tips and sort of, this is something that I've thought about a lot and worked with other people about, why they use Angular, and this maybe might solidify some things here. And for new people, give you a kind of a flagstaff of where Angular lies in the overall landscape. So what is Angular? And when we talk about that, there's sort of three aspects that I typically like to talk about. Angular is an all-in-one framework, all-in-one JavaScript front-end framework. And we're going to talk about what that actually means. Angular is a compiler. And this is new. This is actually not the same as the old version of Angular is not a compiler, but we'll talk about what that means. And then Angular is also an ecosystem. And obviously, everything has an ecosystem, but we're going to talk about what actually the Angular ecosystem means. All right, so who knows who these guys are? There's some Europeans here, right? What is it? Yes, Flying Dutchman. So back in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, there was this concept of total football, right? And in total football, the idea was that, forget about this idea of in soccer that you have, or football, forward and defense. And I mean, anybody who's playing should be able to do the same thing. You should be able to play every position on the field, regardless of whether you're a goalkeeper or whatever else. And that is very different than, there's other teams in other countries that very much believe in specialization, very much believe that you are a striker and that's the one and only thing that you do. And that's more typical, actually. But it's one thing to check the boxes that you can play defense and you can play offense and you can play goalkeeper and whatever else. It's another thing about what type of style you have. And no one typifies the Dutch style more than Johan Cruyff, this guy. So Johan Cruyff was the best player in Dutch history, possibly even the best soccer player in all of history, maybe compared to Pele and that type of thing. And definitely epitomized the concept of total football, can play any position on the field. There were other people, though, who, from other countries, too, that were also able to play any position. One of them, just as an example, a more recent example is, anybody know this, guys? It's like trivia. Okay, Lothar Matthäus. Yes, okay, you know your stuff. So Lothar Matthäus from the 90s, part of the German World Cup winning teams. Awesome, awesome player. Both of these guys, Johan Cruyff and Lothar Matthäus, both check the boxes that they could play any position on the field, but different styles. There was a different feel for them, right? And both of them were different than this guy, Jamie Vardy, who's more of a specialist. He can't play a lick of defense, but he can score, 30, 40 goals a season. And so when you try to think about the different frameworks in comparison, maybe this isn't a totally accurate comparison, but React is like Jamie Vardy. It does one thing and it does it really, really, really well. But you can't have a team of Jamie Vardys. If you have a team of Jamie Vardys, you are going to fail. You need to have other complementary players. You have to build a team from other parts. Whereas with Angular Ember, with Lothar Matthäus or Johan Cruyff, if you had a team of them, just duplicates, you guys would wreck house. And that's the idea. So, but let's get into what the style is and how you would actually, again, so Angular and Ember, as examples, are both all-in-one frameworks, but they're different. They have a different style. So let's talk about the style. And when I talk about the style of Angular, there's kind of 5 areas that I'm going to kind of touch on. The first thing being a term that I made up. This actually isn't a real term, but so strongly typed reactive inversion. It just speaks to these. In terms of Angular core, there's a couple libraries that are separate libraries, but are critical to the overall functionality and the feel of Angular. And actually, I think arguably they're optional, but really they're not. I think originally when they built the latest version of Angular, these were all built in a way that you didn't necessarily have to have them with the framework. But over time, everybody's come to realize that no, the best version of Angular is when you use these. So we actually are going to pretty much say that if you are building an Angular app, you are using these. So TypeScript is a big part. And when we get into the tutorial, you'll see a lot of the parts where TypeScript influence comes in. Pretty much, if you are using Angular, you are using TypeScript. There are some people I've seen do Angular with ES6, and it is technically possible, but don't do that. Reactive, so RxJS. It's, again, something you can use promises, and some people do, the smaller portion, but pretty much majority of the community now is starting to use observables more and more. And it's built into the core framework for a lot of the primitive values within Angular, like we'll see return observables, and you can stream observables and that type of thing, and that's really powerful. And then dependency injection, there are ways to do functional programming with Angular, actually, but I literally know one person on the planet who does that. And actually, I shouldn't say that. People do it in smaller degrees, like use some of the functional programming principles, but in terms of like overall, really, you do rely on dependency injection, and you do buy into the concept of dependency injection, which we'll get into. And then, an all-in-one framework means that it has everything as part of the core. And so in the core of Angular, there are all of these other pieces that help you build an app. So material design for UI components, animations, internationalization, routing. Obviously, with something like React, which is like a focus just on rendering, they have similar things to this, but there's some that are officially sanctioned as like the best thing to use, but then there's some in user land. So it's a little bit more diverse. You don't have like 99% of the community using this kind of same thing. One great thing about Angular versus the old version of Angular, the more recent version, is that it is multi-platform. And this is the reason why Nativescript is able to leverage it, right? This is why you can use the same framework, but then render on the server for SEO-based apps, on native apps, like with Nativescript, or on the desktop with Electron. There's a bunch of other renderers as well. So there's sort of this decoupling between what you're building and the view, how it's like actually rendered. And that's something new. In the older version of Angular, it was very tightly coupled to the DOM, and this would have been, not impossible, but extremely difficult. As far as best practices, this is also something that's new with the latest version of Angular. The older version of Angular really didn't place as big of an emphasis, and you really saw that in the apps that people built, that they were a lot of spaghetti code. Even though it was like going from jQuery to Angular and people were excited about that, it was still just as messy and crazy. Only later did they start to develop Todd Motto's best practices guide and that type of thing. But with the new version of Angular, they, right from the ground up, are baking standards and best practices in with the framework. And the model, and really the biggest influence to this, has been Ember. So I would imagine, other than Tracy, wherever she is, not many people have used Ember in this room. But the one thing that they nailed very early on is convention over configuration. In using a CLI, a strong CLI, having everybody do the same thing in the same way. There's a lot of power in that, because then you can build abstractions on top of it. And so Angular has spent a lot of time and effort, and continues to spend more on the CLI. There's a lot of cool stuff that it's already done, which I'm going to demonstrate, and then there's a lot of cool stuff that's on its way that I'm going to talk about at the very end of the talk here, that will really sets Angular apart from a lot of other frameworks because of this tooling. And then finally, as far as talking about what Angular is, there is, besides core libraries and being multi-platform, there is a whole bunch of common patterns when you're developing apps, especially web apps, that get baked in that you can implement yourself. It's not like you can't, but it's much easier if they're kind of out of the box working correctly. So I'm just going to quickly go through a couple of them that actually are really interesting and in some cases unique for Angular. So for zones, anyone from the Angular 1 world remembers this is Angular 1 code, old Angular code, for that you have to do a scope.apply whenever you change a value outside that Angular doesn't know about. And the reason is that there's an asynchronous call here, set timeout. And with zones, this is not the actual implementation of zones, but this gives you kind of an idea. essentially it monkey patches every async call possible in your code and keeps counters, and it keeps track of all different properties, keep track of errors, so that even if you're going way down in the call stack, you can still track what's happening with your app. And this is extremely powerful. And actually, even though it may be hard to kind of like see how this is applicable to anything, this is actually a problem that many different apps and frameworks have today, which is in different ways knowing when something is stability, when the app is stable. So I'll give you an example of this. So let's say you are running a test, like you're running end-to-end tests against some part of your website. And you need to know when that web component has rendered. Currently, without using zones, you would have to have some sort of callback. You would have to notify your unit test library when that thing is done. But using zones, it knows when all asynchronous calls have completed because it tracks them. It tracks the completion of everything asynchronous in your code. So even though you don't explicitly tell your code that something is done, then it just knows. And this is extremely useful for server rendering as well. This is critical, actually, for server rendering, because otherwise you have to manually tell Angular once every asynchronous call within your code is done. Because if you think about it, when you're writing a web application, you can have asynchronous calls anywhere. Like on any web component or any component in your app, you can make AJAX calls to the back end, and there's no correlation between any of them at all. But Zones does. Zones correlates them all and knows when they're all done, which is really powerful. And in fact, because this is applicable to, it's not just Angular, to any framework, this is something that is being proposed now as a standard for all of JavaScript. So that's still pending. I forget which stage it is right now, but that's something that the Angular team proposed. So lazy loading is something that, again, you could do with other means outside of Angular, but typically, at least from when I've done it, it's kind of a pain to set up. Has anyone set up lazy loading without Angular before? Okay, not surprisingly, no one. And there's a good reason for that. It is a pain, and it's tricky, it's error prone, but Angular has it built in out of the box with the router. So it allows you to just, by changing the configuration here, you can basically say that a particular module shouldn't load initially only when that person goes to the route. That particular route is it then brought down from the server. So that can be really powerful. With Service Worker, again, one of those things that you can implement your own Service Worker, but if you go to mobile.angular.io, there is an extra module that you can pull in, and there's a whole suite of tools and utilities to kind of showcase you that I'm not going to have time to get into today, but it makes it really, really easy. Same with web workers, same thing. Web workers typically, actually this one is probably even harder than Service Worker. If you try to implement your own web worker, it's actually a big, big pain, but using Platform Web Worker, it basically just works right out of the box. There are some issues depending on what your app is doing, but in most cases, it works pretty well. So definitely check that out. And then finally, Angular does publish web components. It publishes things that can be used on the web component platform, which is a new standard, hasn't been fully finalized yet. I believe Apple is still holding out or causing some pain. But there is a lot of promise for being able to provide a whole new level of performance gains and lowering of bundle sizes, et cetera, because you're baking into the browsers itself some of the capabilities that we have in frameworks right now. And one of the coolest things, so it works with Polymer, the integration is okay. I've seen a couple of good examples. But one thing that everybody should get on their radar is Stencil. So Stencil is a lower level web component-based framework built by the Ionic team. And it's built specifically to integrate with higher level frameworks like Angular or React or whatever else. So they're just starting down this road, but the idea is that eventually there'll be a really smooth integration where you can, without, in some cases, changing any of your code, just by kind of integrating some of Stencil, your app is just going to get faster. That's kind of the best way to think about it at a high level. Okay. Let's talk about Angular as a compiler. And this is something that Tom Dale, if you guys know him from the Ember world, wrote a really interesting blog post 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, something like that, about compilers and the new frameworks. And the idea is that we've already started to move into this transpiled world. You know, we use TypeScript, Babel with ES6, et cetera. And even though there's some people who yearn for the days of ES5 and not having to transpile everything, the reality is we're probably going to be in this transpiled world forever. There's a lot of value to do it besides just the browser support for different JavaScript versions. Specifically when it comes to this, which is when you have a framework, a lot of times you can basically do stuff at build time to optimize your application. And this is something that Angular takes full advantage of with ahead-of-time compiling, if you guys have heard of that or if you haven't. Basically, it's a way of Angular looking through your code and then compiling ahead of time, transforming it in such a way that it's smaller and runs faster when you run it in production. So this is just some examples of, like, for some sample apps that they have of, you know, basically an order of magnitude, not an order of magnitude, but like more than half the size in bundle size and then resulting speed after you have it AOT compiled. And there's just a lot of powerful stuff that come from this. So just some examples of like what ends up getting compiled down. So if you're looking, this is just a sample component in Angular. And you know, right here, so there is TypeScript. Like this is a typing right here. And obviously, TypeScript gets compiled down, like the typing isn't actually there in the transpiled code. But beyond that, that's also used by Angular for dependency injection. And one really cool thing is that with the just-in-time compiler, which is not using this pre-compilation thing, not using ahead-of-time compilation, you would still have this big chunk of the core framework that's needed in order to interpret this. In order to correctly inject this value and have this run at runtime, there is a pretty sizable chunk of the framework that's dedicated to that. But when you do ahead-of-time compiling, that entire section of the core framework just isn't needed anymore. And so both the core framework size gets smaller, your own custom code's compiled size gets much smaller. Same thing with component, like the decorator. So this thing, for people that aren't familiar, is the at thing is a decorator. It's not a normal part of JavaScript, although it's proposed for a future version, but it is part of TypeScript. And Angular leverages it mostly for metadata about components. But in the AOT compiled code, none of this is there. It's all transpiled down to much more optimized code, especially when it comes to templates. So there is a big difference. So when you look at the different frameworks, there are a lot of frameworks like React that do more JavaScript-based rendering. So like you look at, it uses JavaScript to actually spit out the HTML rather than an actual template. The major advantage of using a template, which Angular takes advantage of, is because it's declarative, because it has a certain structure, it's much easier to optimize that. So during the AOT process, it'll transform your template here into a much more optimized data structure that is very fast, removes all white space, removes all like unnecessary characters and that type of thing. The other big thing is part of that process, it can actually check your template for errors, like for some of the, like if activities here is not actually referenced here or whatever else, it will actually pick it up at compile time, at build time. Okay. And then finally, in terms of like what Angular is, it's an ecosystem, which means kind of two things. It's third-party libraries, which obviously Nativescript is a big one there. Also, one interesting thing to note is NGRX. So NGRX is a very popular state management library. It is a reactive Redux implementation. Definitely something that if you guys haven't, you should definitely check out. It's very useful, especially when you're doing an app that is both rendered on the web and native. You're using NGRX to manage your state is very useful. But the interesting thing is that state management is not part of core, which would seem to be contrary to what I mentioned earlier, that about this all-in-one framework and everything should be part of core and that type of thing. And this is outside core. But it speaks to the fact that state management is one of these things that is still not in 80-20 in the Angular community. It's very much split. So there's a lot of people who use NGRX, but it's not 80% of the community. It's more like 30% or something like that. It's a sizable chunk. But there's a lot of people that do other things for state management. So the general philosophy of Angular, the Angular core team, is that once something is generally used by like everyone, then they bring it into core. So there is a potential that eventually something like NGRX is brought into core if it ever got to that point. But we'll see. For now, it's just one of these things that I would highly recommend. But it's not that everybody uses NGRX. And then community. So every framework has a community. However, the thing I would say is that the Angular community has a particular feel, especially people that have been in the community for a while understand this. And if you've been in other communities. If I had to kind of boil it down to a couple things, I would say that some of the principles of the Angular community, which is influenced by the leaders, like everybody in the core team, the original creators of Angular, and many people in the community, are these three things. It's building bridges, which means helping other people. It's helping the other people that are in the community to cross the bridges that you have already crossed. Help them to get to where you are. And that's something that I know as an Angular GD, we talk about amongst ourselves and we talk to all the other community members about very often. Practicality over purity. This is one of these things that I do feel that some frameworks that are more like functional programming oriented, you definitely get a lot of purists that like put their nose up at like anything that's not that. But there is a great focus on just getting something working, getting the goal of what you're trying to achieve done, and not worrying about some ugliness that's involved along the way, as long as it achieves the goal. So there's a certain level of practicality that goes throughout the community. And then cooperation over competition, meaning that you don't often find, in fact, I can't recall that I can remember someone from the Angular community writing one of these Framework X versus Framework Y articles. And the reason, it's always one of these other frameworks, and the reason is because most people in the Angular community just have the mindset of all of these other frameworks are great. Like, it's actually good that all of us exist because it pushes each other, it influences each other to get better. And if you guys have been around for a while, you see that certain innovations that happen in one community bleeds over to the other. And that goes both ways. It goes in every direction. Stuff from the Angular community, the stuff that Angular has built over the past 2 years has gone into these other frameworks, and vice versa. So cooperation, helping other communities as well. Okay. So I have this one thing. As I was thinking about a tutorial and kind of like going over Angular, I was thinking almost as like an exercise for myself. Like, I wonder what's the smallest I can get in Angular app in terms of lines of code. Because if you use the Angular CLI, which we will use in the next section and build something, it spits out all sorts of files. Like there's 100 files or something huge right off the bat. And I think I would imagine for most people coming learning, it can be overwhelming, and you clearly just ignore a whole bunch of the files and figure you'll get back to it later. And probably even if you have a couple of years experience, there's been stuff that you've been ignoring for all those years. But I wanted to see what I could do to get it really small. So let's take a look at that. Okay. So this is sort of what was my inspiration. this is an Angular 1 page. And in Angular 1, it was super easy to just hack on it in one page. In just one page, you could put an HTML out there and throw in a script tag and throw something in there, and it was working. So if let me actually start this. Whatever. It's not too sexy, but it works. And it was super simple. And that's actually one of the reasons why Angular 1 was really popular to start with, because it was so easy to get started, right? But you don't have this anymore. Now you got to use TypeScript and Webpack and a million other things. So I wanted to recreate this, but I couldn't do it in one page. But I did do it in two. Plus some supporting files. Yeah, I mean, I have the package JSON and that type of thing, which I'd imagine, I'm not going to go over all of this stuff that I would imagine most people know. But as far as source files, there's only two. So let's talk about the first one. So the server, I was using my own Express server for this particular application. I found that actually when I tried to use one of the other mechanisms, it ended up requiring more files. So this is very simple for anybody who's used Express. It's just one template. You're referencing a bundle, and that's it. That was simple, right? Okay. Let's get to the client. So this is where actually the more interesting thing. Okay. Let's actually start from the bottom up. So this is all one file. It's only 38 lines of code. So an Angular app in 38 lines I think is pretty good considering how big it is when you use the CLI. And this is not using the CLI. This is just sort of handcrafted. Okay. But this is TypeScript. This is using the same underlying framework. So the first thing is just for bootstrapping. So whenever you start your app, so this is, actually one thing I should show before this is that I did build it, just so I want this to be like a no magic demonstration, right? You guys should be able to see exactly what's happening here. And so for building it, I'm just transpiling the TypeScript, TSC. That's really simple, right? And I do have to use Webpack to build the bundle. However, it's like I'm using no Webpack config. I'm not using the CLI, I'm not using any Webpack config. This is, all it's doing is it's pointing to the one client file, and it's just building a package just off of that one file, and that's it. And it's putting it in assets. So does that make sense? Right. It's just taking that one file, putting it into bundle, and then the server is referencing that bundle. Okay?
So do we have to use Webpack instead of Gulp or Run?
So the CLI does use Webpack underneath the scenes. The Webpack is always going to be used. There is a way to not use Webpack, but it's painful. Like I think originally they were trying to set up Angular so that, you could use System.js instead or whatever, but over time they've come to realize that no, just use Webpack. But if you're using the CLI, it is using Webpack under the scenes. You just don't see it. They sort of hide it. So first thing is just bootstrapping. We'll look at the module, but this platform browser dynamics. So we mentioned that there is these different platforms. You can render on the server, Nativescript, etc. So each of these platforms has a different, you use that different class that you use to start the bootstrap. That's what kind of gets everything together that's needed for a particular module. So in this case, platform browser dynamic is one of the main ones that you'll use when you're rendering just a normal web application. All right, the module. So Angular is built at the top level on modules. And you should think of Angular just like when you're building a web page, and this is the same concept as in other frameworks as well, is thinking of breaking your visual page down into components and a tree of components, that you have the page itself, and the page consists of a header and a main section and a footer, and so there are those three, and then those three have like maybe subcomponents and subcomponents and subcomponents, so there's like a tree there, right, for components. It's the same thing for modules, that there is a tree of modules starting out with whatever you're bootstrapping at the top. And in this example, I just have one module. Just this app module is the only thing. But actually, we won't get to in the other examples I have using multiple modules. But if you do want to use lazy loading and you do want to use some more advanced features, you will want to break up your app into multiple modules. But Angular makes that pretty simple. It basically comes down to, if we have time, I'll hand code one in the other code base when I switch to that. But basically, it's creating something like this for a small set of files, and then you bring in the thing in the module from your subdirectory into here, into the top level module. So we'll see if we can get to that. But in this case, what the module is doing is defining everything that's part of some section of your code. So declarations are components, so they're visual items in your code. Imports are basically other modules, so that's where the tree comes in. And then Bootstrap, this is just when you want to, where you're starting your rendering. So that's like the top level component. So there's a tree of modules, and then within each module, there's a tree of components, starting with whatever you're bootstrapping, in this case, app component. So this is the top level component. If I wanted to, so let's just as an example, if I wanted to add some like subcomponents, let's just do subcomponent. And let's do div. Okay, so I'll explain what I'm doing here in just a second. And so whenever you add a new component, you need to add it to the declarations so that the application knows that it is a component and knows to render it. And the component tells you, the selector is what it is replacing in the parent. So in this case, this is the parent component, this is the top level component. And like, so just other examples, this is just like any other CSS selector. So you could also do something like .foo, which you would have to change this to div class equals foo. So it's a selector, just like any other CSS selector. And it selects stuff from the parent component. And then right here in the parent component, we're rendering a property. So that's what's set in the actual properties of the class. I could also this isn't total best practice, but if you wanted to change this to so this would overwrite it. So like this is the initial, what it's initialized to, and then this is obviously overwriting it, and so this would display, end up displaying this phrase instead of this other one. The constructor is also where in Angular you inject things. So just again, for the couple people that aren't familiar with this, as an example, if I wanted to inject a class, so like let's say you had some like foo service. Everything is foo in my world. Foo service. Let's actually create that. And so this is just a class with get amount, which returns 5. I'm just making something up. And let's say, actually we have another some amount, number, and some amount. And let's do this dot sum amount equals foo service dot get amount. So what this is doing is it's injecting foo service, this thing that I just created quickly up here. And in order to do that, I have to actually add it. Anything you add to your code, whether it's a service or a component or anything, you have to add to your module. Now, when we get to the CLI, you'll see that the CLI will automatically add that for you, but since I'm not using the CLI, I have to manually add it. So the way you do that is providers and foo service, use class foo service. So the Angular DI system is awesome. It's one of these things that they did have DI in Angular 1, but it was pretty junky. It caused a lot of issues. It was the reason why you had to put a lot of extra cruft in your code in order to make sure that your minimized code didn't break. But the Angular DI is super powerful because you can use tokens, like that's what these are. Like you're saying, whenever you see foo service, use this thing. In this case, we're using the same thing, but we could have an alternative. We could do class foo server, let's see, or foo browser service, which instead of returning 5, we could return 6. And what you could do is set. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying whenever the injector sees foo service, don't actually provide that class. Instead, provide this other thing. So here, who thinks, I mean, I know the experienced people know this, but for people that are unfamiliar with Angular, what do you think some amount is going to be set to? Right. Because the other alternative, foo browser services, is injected, which returns 6, and then that's what you're setting there. No, not in this case. So just as a general rule, you should just add it because it's not harmful. So the thing he was mentioning is that in a lot of cases, you would put injectable on the service. The reason why it's not needed is that what that does is it enables the injector to work at another level down. So if I added a constructor here and I injected other stuff here, so if I had a constructor and I injected something else here, then I would need the injectable because it's for the next things down on the DI tree, dependency tree. What was that?
How to make singleton?
What makes it do that?
How to make singleton?
Oh, sorry.
Singleton? How to make singleton like transient right now, right?
Oh, a singleton?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So it's singleton by default. So like when you do the use class, it will be a singleton. It basically does a new on that class, and then it will use that same thing every time. If you want to use, in the old Angular version, they had the thing where it would generate it each time. That's the use factory. So use factory is the other one where it's not a singleton. Or if you want to, one thing that's interesting, so one thing, so I mentioned that I built the original Angular Universal, the server rendering library, but actually not just with that, with any multi-platform app, which actually, especially you guys building Nativescript apps, you guys will come into something where you want to have some common interface or some common token, but it's something different on each platform. This is a very common thing with multi-platform development. You want some downstream dependency to be different, platform specific, right? So maybe going back to this, let's actually change the names of these. Like, let's say it's foo Nativescript service here, and actually, let me have a separate one here. So foo browser service and foo Nativescript service, right? Which does something else. So in this case, typically for each platform, you would end up having your own bootstrap. So I mean, I'm doing everything in one file right here for simplicity's sake, but you would end up, in order to differentiate between the different platforms, all of your components, well, for browser and server, your components can be the same because the Nativescript view layer is different. The Nativescript view, it uses Nativescript XML. Those do have to be different. But for, let's say, the web and server, you can use the same components, but you would have to have a separate app like server module, which you would then, if it had a, let's say we have a Nativescript, we have a server version of this. And obviously I'm not changing anything here, but the idea is that you would for each platform. Then you could have two different apps. One that references foo browser service, one that references foo server service. So then in your components are basically isomorphic because they are referencing just foo service, the same thing on both platforms, but it actually is something different. Does that make sense? All right. Yeah. So that was, just one quick thing in case, because I'll show it in the next example, but there are just polyfills that are needed just for getting some of this stuff to work for zones and that type of thing. And that gets abstracted out. With the CLI, you don't see it as much, but with this, if you guys do check out my example online and you're wondering what that is, that's basically it. Okay. Let's get back to this for a second. Are we doing on time? Okay, we're doing good on time. All right, so getting started. Using the CLI, really easy to get started. You basically, these are just some of the basic CLI commands to get started. No big deal, you can get a running app in, well, it usually takes npm install a couple minutes, but then it's up and running. So let's just take a look. I didn't want to have to npm install and you guys watch that just sit there for a couple minutes, so I did it ahead of time. But it's basically, this is just a basic default app that gets generated and a lot more files. So I'm going to just talk a couple quick things in terms of, as you're getting started, what you should or shouldn't pay attention to. I know everybody loves to write unit tests and end-to-end tests, right? Everybody does? Yes?
Of course.
Oh yeah, of course. I do it all the time, every day. No. No, seriously though, when you're getting started, just ignore this. And probably my GD friends are gonna yell at me for that, but seriously, like most of the time you just want to play around with the app and it just gets in the way. So it's great that it's there. You could pretend that your app has testing. In fact, if you can actually run the tests and it passes because it's not doing anything. But no, in here is the main thing that you want to look at. So in your source folder, main.txt is, for the simple example, it's where I started, but this is the starting point of your app. And this is web only, so this isn't Nativescript or server or anything like that. We'll add that in a little bit. But this is using the same thing, platform browser dynamic, Bootstrap, the module. Let's look at the module. So by default, they just generate a lot more files. I did add one thing as an example here. So, oops. Very similar to the other example, just a couple more components. I added a few more. If you want to add a component, actually, let me go to this. So the command, I'm not going to go through every CLI command and that type of thing, but just know that besides scaffolding your app by using ng-new, pretty much any other component that you want, you can create as well. So ng create component blah. Oops. What did I do? Oh, generate. Generate. Yeah. Right. Now, you may say, okay, I don't like the directories that it put it in, or you don't like the fact that it spit out all these files. You just want it to be some files and not others. The nice thing is it does wire it up. Like I mentioned, you do have to wire it up in the module, and it does that for you. So it already put it in the module, so it's already wired up and ready to work. But you may have a different style decision. So just one note, I'm not going to get into it too much, but if you go into the Angular CLI JSON, so this is what drives the CLI. And the CLI is super powerful. It's really flexible. It started off with a bunch of defaults in terms of how the app is supposed to be scaffolded and what it's supposed to include. But you can basically change almost anything. If I wanted to, I think it's, yeah. So if I wanted to use inline styles, I could do that, etc. And actually, I didn't show that in the other version. Let me quickly show that now. So I showed the module, and so for the component in this generated one, because I didn't change any of the defaults, it's using I'll explain this in a minute, so just ignore this one. It's using external files. So that's the default where it uses the external files, which are in the same directory for the HTML or for CSS for each component. But to be frank, it's my personal preference. I actually don't like the external files. So it's pretty easy to change that. It's just, instead of template URL, use template. And I could just bring in the HTML from here to the component. And that's it. You will notice that by default, so I'm using Visual Studio Code. One tip is there are a couple extensions you definitely want to use, because you'll see that the template actually has text highlighting and that type of thing. But this is a string. The reason why that works is because I have some Visual Studio Code extensions. Definitely install the Angular language service. Definitely install, it's named Angular 2 inline, but it works with any more recent version of Angular. Those two at the very least, always install. There's also, I use key bindings, that's neither here nor there. I'm a big fan of Prettier, so I would recommend Prettier, but that's a style decision. Also, I like the tslint extension enforces whatever your tslint file is, which for, again, some formatting stuff, so. Oops. Okay. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Angular 2 inline is the second one. So definitely, these first two are must-haves. You definitely need to do. These other ones at the bottom are just nice-to-haves. TSLint's probably a must-have too. I would say that is the third one. Yeah, so I prefer inline style. It's just my own personal preference. And just as to expand on that a little bit, I mentioned earlier NGRX before, and one thing, just my recommendation for you as even people that are experienced in building apps is your component really should be just about the template for the most part, and binding to your template, and which I'm going to show in a second actually, and bubbling up events. But besides that, a lot of your business logic you should push to external services, whether if you're using NGRX or something else. The reason is it just makes it much easier to share your code between different apps, between native and web, etc. So that's why I don't mind doing inline HTML, because the HTML is almost everything in my components. Like I don't put much in the actual functions. However, just to demonstrate a little bit about this, I am going to add some stuff just to kind of showcase a little bit about what Angular is able to do. The first thing actually I will explain is what I already have here for routing. So for routing, it starts at the module level of what are the routes. So you have just an array of routes, which is just pointing from a path. There's other options too, but I'm giving kind of the simpler version, which is just a path, and then what component it's routing to. And the router module has to take those routes as input, but then it'll route to those components. And then at your top level, I mean, typically you don't have to put it at your top level, but for most apps that I built, actually, it does depend, but at least for this one, when I run this, you'll see at the top level, we have the router outlet, and the router outlet is basically where the router will replace that with whatever route you're at, whatever the component for whatever route you're at. So let's actually just run this before I start changing this code more. And almost certainly since I messed around with stuff, I'm sure I broke something. And okay, great. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so it doesn't do much. Actually, in fact, it just has the links at the top, home and about. That's what these are. And then this section here is where it's replacing it with the different component. Going back to the module. So it's switching between the home component and the about component. So if I go into the home component, oh, yeah. Let's get to that in a minute. So the about component first, I'll just point out, so whatever, that just has a template that it just says about works, which click on about and okay, it does that. Let's play around with the home component. I was starting to mess around with this earlier. And basically, when you click on home, right now it's not showing anything. Well, it's showing 1, 2, 3 because I'm injecting this activity service, which has, so I just want to show an example of, just like I showed with the simple example, it's a service that just has this method with 3 things, 1, 2, 3, and and so it's setting that to activities, and then I'm just displaying it. Just to really quickly show you a different variation of this. It's actually sorry. Okay. So let's instead of this, let's return actual objects. So like these will be activity objects that contain like name, activity 1, and task equals soccer. Sport. Sorry. Activity 2, football. Just for now, I'm just going to turn any to make this work. And okay, so now activities is not returning numbers. So this will actually, it'll just show like a bunch of objects, the object, right? So instead of this, let's actually switch this out and do span activity.name. And span activity dot I call it sport. So one thing actually, oh, right. So the reason why, you'll see it isn't highlighted, or it's highlighted in red because it doesn't know the type definition for an activity. I set it as any. So if I wanted to fix that actually, I have to actually define the interface. So let's do export interface activity, which has a name, string, and sport string. And then instead of any, we could do activity. And then let's go back to home. And this should, where did I put number? What's that? Oh, yes, you're absolutely right. Thank you. Thank you. Right. So it's because right here I was defining it as a number, but now I'm going to change it to activity. And yes. So that's the cool thing. Even though it's a template, even though it's in a string, it can detect, because of TypeScript and because of the Angular language service and everything, that it's not a valid value. So just explaining a couple things here. So obviously I'm doing the double curlies, which if you've seen in Angular 1 is just a way of taking a binding. One difference is that there is by default not two-way binding in Angular. They do have one thing that's part of the Angular forms module for mimicking two-way binding, but it doesn't really do it. It's kind of one way underneath the scenes still. So the other thing is I'm using ng4 here with the star. I'm not going to, there's a whole history of some of the syntax, which is kind of excruciating to get into. But the basic syntax is either within an attribute is either star for any templating based thing like ng4, or bracket. So if I do, so I did curly braces there, but if I instead did like this value equals, actually, let me do it inside. If I did span, actually it's inner HTML equals, so what this is, the brackets is a way of doing binding as well. So like the curly braces do binding, but then the brackets do binding as well. The brackets are setting whatever the value is, or whatever the variable is, to the underlying attribute. So like there is an attribute inner HTML, or property rather, of that element. And it's setting, this should, let me restart, yeah. So activity 1, yeah, so this will do it twice because I'm listing the name twice. If I remove this, it'll, should, yeah. So, and then the final thing is event handling. So for a button, okay. So the parentheses are used for capturing an event. So in this case, doClick doesn't actually exist, so I have to actually define it. Okay. No, I didn't. Duh. Right. Yeah. So yeah, it's right, capturing that event. So I wanted to, yeah, I have time for this. I wanted to showcase a little bit, and almost certainly up to this point, I amazingly have not broken the app by messing around with it. I'm usually terrible at live coding. And I'm going to take a risk here and make this a server rendered app. And I guarantee that this is going to not work. But let's try it anyway. OK. So, well, first of all, I mean, I'm not going to go into the whole thing of server rendering. But do you guys understand like why we do server rendering in the first place? Who has no idea why you would ever want to do server rendering?
No idea. Just
Cool. Yeah. So I'll give it a quick thing before I explain how to do it. Most of the time, it's for publicly facing apps. So it's apps that are publicly available on the internet where you actually want it to be indexed in the Google search engine. Now, Google will index client-rendered apps, but it's not perfect. Other search engines other than Google don't do it well. And then there's other things outside of Google that you want, like when somebody copies a URL into Facebook or into Twitter, and it does that kind of like preview thing, it won't do that if it's only client rendered. So for most of the time when you have a publicly facing app, you do want it server rendered. If it's internal app, I mean, it doesn't really help that much. But let me see if I can do this quickly. We'll see. I'll set the timer 2:15. All right. I do have. I can cheat a little bit. I'm going to take a little bit from my other app here. But there's essentially like 4 things you have to do to change the app for it to be server rendered. The first thing is in this CLI. So there's this section of the Angular CLI JSON, which says apps. It basically defines a whole bunch of stuff for the CLI to work with, your app. And most of the time, it's just one app. But if you want to do a server rendered thing, you need to have like a second app. So I'm just going to copy this and bring it over for this thing, and copy it into. Okay. And then you'll notice in here, there's a couple values. So it needs a main server. So there's a couple things at the top level which are used, which are platform specific. So it's the same thing if you were doing a Nativescript app. Nativescript will be different because each of the components would be different as well. Really with, I think Sebastian is giving a talk later about a Nativescript and web app. And really, it's all about pushing stuff down to the service level, and that's what you're sharing. But for the web and server, you can share components, but you cannot share the module level. So let me give up. So there's the main.ts, which we're going to do a new file for main server.ts. And I'm going to, oops, not that. Right. Right. Actually, probably easier to show the low. I was going to go from the top down, but it's probably makes more sense if I go from the bottom up. So the module level. So it's main dot you're adding the app to the Angular CLI JSON. You're creating a separate main, which is like that entry point. You're creating a separate module because the modules have to be different for each platform as well. So let's create an app server.module. And for this, server. Change that. On the server side, so you do have some concerns on the browser that you don't have on the server. So on the browser side, you want to be very careful about what you import because you want to reduce the size of your bundle. Like whatever you import and use in your application for the browser side, that's going to increase the size of the bundle when Webpack pulls it all in. On the server side, it's not as big of a deal. So a shorthand for creating our module is to basically import the browser module, which is this app module. This is what's being used for the browser. And so basically, the imports are done in order that you're listing it in the array. So basically, I'm saying, give me everything from the browser module, but then override it with the server module, which is the platform server here. And I do have to install that. So let me npm install. And actually, we're going to ignore this for a second. OK. So this is pretty simple for now, at least. So the app server module and then the main server. OK. And then we do have to, so that's four things, right? The Angular CLI JSON, the main server, the app server module, that's three things. And then the fourth thing is just our script for building it. So in package.json, by default, when you're building it, it just does ng build. There's a slight difference for when we want to build both the client and the server at the same time. So let me copy this over. And what this is doing is, so it's building the client here. So this part is building the server side. So the universal here is of reference to what I put in the CLI JSON. I named it universal. And so it's going to build it and put it into a dist server. Oh, there's a fifth thing, the tsconfig. So we do need a separate tsconfig for this. So let me add that. And okay, so that should be, yes. That should be enough to build. Let's try to build. And if this works, hopefully. Oh, I see what the problem is. Let's try that again. The server tsconfig is extending the client tsconfig and then adding a couple server-specific stuff for mostly, the biggest thing is the entry module that it's pointing to the Angular server module that I created. Got created, nice. Okay, so now we have this dist server. Okay, so basically we have everything built now. Now we just have to execute it. And there's different ways to do this actually, to actually run the server. It all depends on what server container you want to use to execute this. There is something that we created, the Express engine. Let me just copy this over and I'll explain it. All right, so there is the Angular Universal Library, when we started out, was everything for server rendering. But since then, we kind of pulled a bunch of stuff into Angular core. And this thing that's remaining in the actual quote-unquote Universal Library is essentially just this Express engine. So it's a wrapper using Express on the server to run your Universal app. So I won't go through every line of code here, but needless to say, this is just a basic Express implementation that uses that dist-server, the stuff that was outputted, and then it's just running it in this container. So instead of doing using ngserve, because ngserve will just do the browser only. I instead do npm server and hopefully, or node server, sorry. What did I do?
Did you save it?
Ah, that was probably it. Oh, of course. Okay. I knew this was going to happen, and I just have a couple minutes left. So let's put this to the side. I knew I was going to screw this up. I'll publish it later for a version, but it's basically around the same lines for making it server rendered. Let's go back and finish this out. Okay. And there's two great courses. I mean, there's a bunch of courses out there. These are two that I really like. From Deborah Carrata and Todd Motto, you should check out. Okay, let's talk about the future. So, a bunch of stuff that is, oh, yeah. Sorry about that. Sorry. Okay, a bunch of stuff that's about to come out that I want to quickly go over. AOT by default, so right now, the ahead of time compilation is done really just when you're publishing it to when you're pushing something out to production. When you are actually testing locally, it's using the just-in-time compilation. It's not like optimizing your code and that type of thing. And that's actually led to like a lot of issues because it's like only when you deploy to production then you start seeing certain weird things. Like for example, in your decorators, there are some things that are invalid you're not supposed to put in there just because it makes it hard for the AOT compiler to actually optimize your code. So it'll complain about those when you try to actually publish it to production. So now they're moving towards just AOT all the time, AOT by default. That's going to be in, I believe it's going to be Angular 5. They might do it in an earlier release because it is. I forget about that, but it is coming soon. One really, probably the thing I'm second most excited for is the component dev kit. This is something that Tracy blogged about a couple weeks ago. And it's basically something where, like, I love Angular material, but we have a designer in-house at GetHuman, and he wants to do his things his own way. He likes some of the Angular material styles, but he doesn't necessarily like it all. He doesn't want to just drop it in. But with the component dev kit, you can basically use all of the underlying, the things that Angular material figured out, like all the hard problems, like building a large data table, which is actually really hard on the web to like make it fast and performant, or how scrolling works, or you know, there's a couple things that the Angular material project figured out that you can now use to build your own UI library. So this is like a really powerful lower level library for people who want to build their own UI libraries. And this is really cool. And Nathan told me that he's going to get this working with Nativescript like next week. So you should push him for that. Schematics is something where, as part of the Angular CLI project, they've said for a while they want to open up people building plugins for the CLI, and this is going to really enable a lot of that. It's basically an easy way for you to get into the pipeline of the CLI. And this itself is, like, I'm not going to get too much into explaining all of how it works. The main gist here is that because of this, like this in itself is like whatever. It's not going to help you tomorrow. But because this exists, you're going to see an explosion in the capabilities of the CLI because this opens up the doors for everybody else who wants to enhance the Angular CLI with different variations and additional capabilities. Like, for example, one thing that they talked about on the Nativescript side is being able to more closely integrate the two. And this makes it a lot easier. The animations library, the web animations for Angular is super awesome. There are a lot of things that if you've done animations on the web before, it can be a real pain knowing when you're trying to like apply it in your CSS. The short of it with all the stuff that's in the new animations release is that it allows you to do really, really complex animations with just JavaScript. You don't have to get down to CSS at all. So this is a huge thing in itself. Matthias Niemela, who created this library, he has a great talk at ngconf that he did, and he did it one more recently at the Angular meetup in Mountain View. So definitely check those out online. I'll try to post a link in my slides when I distribute it as well. And then finally, Bazel. So how many people have heard of Bazel? Okay, one person. Two people, sort of? Okay. This is one of these things that, yeah, it's not that popular right now, or not many people know about it, but you will, especially when you're working with Nativescript, because this is going to open up the doors to make it easier to build an app on both Nativescript and Angular at the same time as far as the build process goes. And I know that, again, there's a talk later that Sebastian's doing on some of this. I don't believe he's using Bazel yet, because this is like pretty new. But it's basically taking tooling that Google has internally for mono repos and building multiple things in one repo, multiple build configurations, and opening it up to the open source community. And so Alex Eagle wrote a great blog post about what Angular is doing with Bazel. The two biggest things to keep in mind is multiple apps in one repo, and the other thing is optimizing the recompile time, because using Bazel, allowing you to have different build configurations at different parts of your app, will open up the doors for the CLI to recompile small sections of your app without recompiling the whole thing, which will make the reload time much, much faster. And Victor Savkin's been doing a lot of work on it. He's actually the one who's building the updates to the Angular CLI itself to use Bazel. So that hasn't fully landed yet, but that's going to be upcoming. And I wrote a blog post on this subject as well. And in fact, I am giving a talk in a couple months at Angular Connect for anybody who is going to be there on this same subject. So definitely stay tuned and check that out as well. But that's all the time I have. So thanks a lot. We're out of time, but we can probably answer a couple questions. Yeah.
With schematics, does that enable the NGRX team or the community to generate some boilerplate?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Definitely. Yeah. Yeah. It's for scaffolding or for transformations.
Okay.
Yeah.
In addition, this is more maybe personal to GetHuman. You're using Prettier.
Yeah.
So does GetHuman have a standard Prettier content file that you all share around?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Would you recommend any way of managing that type of configuration file across team members?
We usually just copy it. Yeah. I hear what you're saying. We haven't built any like formalized mechanism for that, so it's pretty informal right now. So. Anything else? Okay. Thanks a lot.